There's a specific kind of Tuesday morning you've had more than once. The plan was solid. You'd built the whole thing on Sunday, clean and logical, and for about 48 hours it held. Then Tuesday arrived with its particular quality of ordinary difficulty. Nothing dramatic, just the friction of a real day. And the version of you who made the plan on Sunday was nowhere to be found. You did what you always do in that moment. You told yourself you'd reset on Monday. That's not a motivation problem. That's not a willpower problem. That's a design problem. And you've been trying to fix it with the wrong tool for years. Willpower is a renewable resource the same way your phone battery is renewable. Great at full charge, negotiating with itself by 4 p.m., making decisions by evening that the morning version of you would not recognize. I spent a long time believing the gap between who I intended to be and who actually showed up on Tuesday was a character issue. It wasn't. It was architecture. The Sunday version had motivation. The Tuesday version had a system that hadn't been built for Tuesday. The people who appear effortlessly consistent are not running on a bigger battery. They stopped relying on the battery entirely. They built structures that make the right behavior easier than the wrong one. Systems that run on ordinary days, not inspired ones. That don't require a particular feeling to activate. What follows is not a motivational injection. You've had enough of those. This is structural. How the morning sets the day before you're aware it's happening. Where your attention actually goes versus where you think it goes. What happens in your brain when you make a promise and break it, and why the damage runs deeper than the missed behavior. How to return after falling without turning the fall into a story. You are not someone who lacks discipline. You are someone running flawed architecture on hardware that was always sufficient. Time to rebuild it. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The morning you keep losing. Your phone wins every single morning. And it doesn't even try. It just sits there, quietly, waiting. And the moment your eyes open, before you've had a single thought that belongs to you, your hand moves toward it. Not because you decided to, because you always have. The phone doesn't need a strategy. It has something better. Habit. Specifically, yours. Picture someone sitting at the edge of their bed at 6:47 a.m. They haven't stood up yet. They're already 3 emails deep, half reading a news story that'll be irrelevant by noon, and vaguely aware of something someone posted last night that has nothing to do with their life. 12 minutes pass. They haven't moved. They feel behind. They can't explain why. The day hasn't started, and they've already lost it. That's not a morning. That's a surrender dressed as a routine. Your morning is not just a time of day. It's a negotiation between 2 versions of you. The one who operates from intention, and the one who operates from reaction. And whoever wins that first exchange tends to win the whole day. Not because of some cosmic law, because of momentum. Small decisions train your brain to expect more of the same. Win the first moment, and your mind starts looking for the next win. Lose it, and you spend the rest of the day trying to claw back focus you handed away before breakfast. This is not a metaphor. There's a neurological mechanism behind it. Every deliberate action you take, especially early, especially when you didn't have to, sends a signal to the part of your brain that manages self-concept. The signal is simple. I'm someone who directs my own behavior. That signal accumulates. It shapes how you approach the next decision and the one after that. The brain is not subtle about this. It takes what you did this morning as evidence of who you are today. The reverse is also true. Every time you hand your first waking moments to something that demands nothing from you, You confirm a different identity, someone who reacts, someone who follows, someone whose attention is available to whoever wants it first. You don't feel this confirmation consciously, but it's happening. And by the time you're halfway through your morning in that state, the idea of doing something focused, deliberate, or difficult has quietly become less accessible. Not because you're lazy, but because you've already been programming yourself in the opposite direction for 45 minutes. I spent a long stretch of time being extremely disciplined about everything except my mornings. Full systems, solid habits, real structure. And then I'd wake up and immediately start reading things that had nothing to do with anything I was building. By noon, I was capable. By noon, I'd also already wasted the only hours that were fully mine. What breaks the pattern isn't a heroic morning ritual. It's an anchor. One small, deliberate action that happens before the phone, before the noise, before any external input gets a vote. It doesn't need to be impressive. It needs to be yours. A slow breath before standing. A minute of silence before speaking. A single sentence written down about what today is actually for. The anchor works because of what it signals, not what it does. It tells your brain, we decided first. Then the world gets access. That sequence, intention before input, is the entire game. Everything else flows from it or against it. Most people design their mornings around convenience. Whatever requires the least resistance first thing. And convenience, left unchallenged, will always point you toward the phone, toward the couch, toward the path of least cognitive friction. Your environment is silently running your behavior while you believe you're making choices. The notification that pulls you out of bed isn't asking permission. It already knows you'll obey. Change the sequence, and you change what your brain expects from you. The version of you that checks the phone first is not less capable than the version that doesn't. They have identical hardware. The difference is purely architectural, which inputs arrive first, and what that trains the brain to anticipate. One version spends the morning reacting to the world. The other spends it leading it. They feel completely different from the inside. They produce completely different days. Winning your morning doesn't mean becoming a person who wakes up at 5 a.m., doing cold plunges and journaling in silence for 2 hours. It means becoming a person who doesn't immediately hand their attention to something that hasn't earned it. It means making the first decision of the day a real one, chosen, not automatic. That distinction, made consistently, is the root of everything else. The world will take everything you give it, your distraction, your attention, your first hour. It will take all of it and ask for more. Your morning is the one moment when you get to decide whether to give it. Win that moment. The rest of the day is negotiating from strength instead of debt. Chapter 2. What distraction is actually stealing? You are not distracted because you lack focus. You are distracted because focus is being harvested from you. There's a difference. One is a character flaw, the other is an engineering problem, and you are living inside the engineering. Every app on your phone was designed by a team of people whose singular professional objective was to make you unable to stop using it. They are very good at their jobs. Treating this as a personal failure is like blaming yourself for being cold in a room specifically designed to be freezing. Watch someone sit down to do real work, not easy work, real work. The kind that requires sustained thought. They open their laptop, they stare at the document for maybe 90 seconds. Then, without deciding to, they open a new tab, check something, close it. Return to the document. 40 seconds. Phone lights up. They glance at it, don't respond. But the thought is already somewhere else now. 5 minutes later, they're reading something completely unrelated, and they have no clear memory of how they got there. That is not laziness. That is a nervous system that has been trained by years of constant interruption to treat sustained attention as uncomfortable and novelty as relief. The human brain did not evolve for deep focus. It evolved for threat detection, movement in the peripheral vision, unexpected sounds, changes in the environment. Every notification, every ping, every new thing that appears on a screen is tickling the exact same system that kept your ancestors alive. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and a text message. Both arrive as, "Something changed, pay attention." The brain that ignored those signals didn't survive. Yours is descended from the ones that didn't ignore anything. This is not an excuse. It is a map. Here's what the map shows. Distraction isn't stealing your time. Time is the decoy. What distraction is actually stealing is cognitive depth. And depth is where everything that matters gets built. There's a concept researchers call attention residue. When you switch from one task to another, part of your attention stays on the first task. It doesn't transfer cleanly. A fragment of your processing power lingers back there, holding the thread, waiting to see if you return. The more frequently you switch, the more residue accumulates. And a mind full of attention residue is operating at a fraction of its actual capacity. Scattered across a dozen half-finished mental threads, unable to sink fully into any of them. This is why you can be busy for 8 hours and feel like you did nothing. You weren't absent. You were fragmented. I noticed this clearly one afternoon, while trying to write something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I had the ideas. I had the time. I checked my phone 4 times in the first 20 minutes. Nothing important, nothing urgent. And by the time I put it face down in another room, I'd lost the thread entirely. Not because the phone contained anything that mattered, because the switching itself had erased the depth I'd built. Deep focus feels like friction at first. This is important to understand. When you sit down to do real work and your mind starts pulling towards something easier, that pull is not a signal that you should switch. It's a signal that you're close to the kind of concentration that actually produces something. The discomfort is the depth being built. Most people interpret it as boredom and leave right before the good part. Protecting focus is not about having more willpower than the distraction. Willpower is the wrong tool entirely. You are not stronger than a billion-dollar attention industry, and you shouldn't have to be. Protecting focus is about removing the negotiation. Make the distraction physically less accessible, not harder to reach. Less accessible. Phone in another room, not face down on the desk. Notifications off, not silenced. The difference sounds small. The behavioral difference is enormous. Your environment is doing more of your decision-making than you realize. Objects in your field of vision create low-level cognitive pulls, even when you're not consciously engaging with them. A phone on the desk is not neutral. It is a small, persistent tug on your attention, constantly offering an exit from whatever requires effort. Remove the exit, and suddenly the effort becomes the only available path. The brain adapts quickly to what's actually available. What you protect focus for matters as much as the protection itself. Distraction is most powerful when you're working on something vague, a goal without a next specific action, a project without a defined output. Vagueness creates the opening. When your brain doesn't know exactly what it's supposed to be doing, it goes looking for something that feels more defined. A notification is extremely defined. It says, "Look here, respond to this. Do this small thing." The specificity is part of the appeal. The counter move is specificity on your end. Not work on the project, but write the opening section until it's done. Not focus for an hour, but complete this one defined thing. The brain can lock onto a specific target in a way it simply cannot lock onto a vague intention. Focus protected with no clear object is just quiet restlessness. The attention economy is not going anywhere. The engineering will get more precise. The pulls will get more sophisticated. The only sustainable response is to become someone who treats their attention as a resource with real value, something to be deliberately allocated, not passively drained. Because everything you want to build requires it. Not motivation, not inspiration, not the perfect conditions. Just long, uninterrupted stretches of your mind pointing at something that matters. That's what's being stolen. And now you know where to look. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, The Comfort Trap. Comfort doesn't restore you. It just makes the next hard thing feel harder. Most people don't know this yet. They've built an elaborate internal logic around rest, around the idea that the reason they can't face difficult things is because they haven't recovered enough. One more day, one more easy evening, one more Sunday where nothing is demanded. And then they tell themselves they'll be ready. They are never ready. Picture someone at the end of a long week, genuinely tired. They've earned the couch, and they know it. They sit down, pull up something easy to watch, and feel the tension leave their shoulders. This is recovery, they think. This is what I needed. 2 hours later, they're still there. Not because they're still recovering, because leaving has become harder than staying. The couch has done something subtle and almost invisible. It has recalibrated their baseline. Compared to the couch, everything else now requires effort, including standing up. That recalibration is the trap. Your brain is a prediction machine that's obsessed with efficiency. It constantly monitors the ratio of effort to reward. When you spend extended time in low-effort, low-demand states, it quietly adjusts its sense of what's normal. Comfort becomes the new baseline. And anything that deviates from that baseline, work, exercise, a difficult conversation, a task you've been avoiding, gets flagged as disproportionately costly. Not because it got harder, because you got softer. The difficulty didn't increase. Your tolerance decreased. This is the mechanism behind the classic Sunday dread. The week ahead feels heavy, not because it's objectively heavier than previous weeks. It feels heavy because you spent 2 days in a comfort state, and your nervous system has quietly recalibrated around that. The contrast is the problem, not the work itself. Here's where it gets more uncomfortable. A significant portion of what people call rest is not rest. It is avoidance wearing a bathrobe. Real rest restores capacity. It leaves you with more energy, more clarity, more readiness to engage with difficulty. Avoidance does the opposite. It drains capacity slowly by allowing unfinished things to accumulate pressure in the background while you pretend to ignore them. The body knows the difference, even when the mind pretends otherwise. You can feel it. Real rest has a quality of settling, the nervous system genuinely down-regulating, the mind going quiet. Avoidance has a quality of low-level static. You're horizontal but not resting. You're distracted but not restored. You get up from it feeling vaguely worse than when you sat down. slightly behind, carrying something you can't quite name. A friend of mine would disappear for entire weekends whenever a project got hard. He called it recharging. He'd come back Monday describing how much he'd relaxed, and then spend the next 3 days fighting the same resistance he'd been avoiding before the weekend. The project hadn't changed. He hadn't recharged. He'd just postponed the friction and charged interest on it. The logic of comfort as recovery only holds when the discomfort being recovered from is physical. Genuine physical depletion requires genuine rest. But most of the discomfort people are trying to escape is psychological. The friction of doing something uncertain, effortful, or ego-threatening. And psychological friction doesn't respond to rest. It responds to engagement. The only way out is through, and comfort is a door that leads back to the same hallway. This doesn't mean you should never stop. It means you should understand what you're actually doing when you do. Deliberate rest and reflexive avoidance require different responses. Deliberate rest is chosen with intention, a specific window, a genuine purpose, a return point already established. It has edges. Reflexive avoidance is open-ended. It expands to fill whatever space is available. It doesn't have a return point because the goal beneath the surface is never to return. The brain's avoidance system evolved for genuine threats. It is extraordinarily effective at keeping you away from things that might harm you. The problem is that it cannot reliably distinguish between a situation that would actually damage you and a situation that merely feels uncomfortable. Starting a difficult project feels uncomfortable. Having a hard conversation feels uncomfortable. Sitting with uncertainty about whether something you made is any good, deeply uncomfortable. The avoidance system treats all of it identically. Retreat, delay, find something easier. You are being protected from your own potential by a system that means well and calibrates badly. The counter move is not to eliminate the discomfort. That's not available. The counter move is to shrink the gap between discomfort and action, to reduce the amount of negotiating time you give yourself before beginning. Negotiation is where avoidance lives. The longer you sit with, "I don't want to do this," the more elaborate the reasons become. The reasons sound like logic. They are not logic. They are the avoidance system doing what it was designed to do. Build a convincing case for staying safe. Start before you feel ready. Not because readiness is a myth. Sometimes you genuinely aren't ready. But because readiness, for most things, is a feeling that arrives after starting, not before. You do not think your way into a state of readiness. You act your way there. The discomfort at the beginning of hard work is not a sign that you shouldn't be doing it. It is the sensation of your nervous system adjusting to a new demand. It passes. Not immediately, but reliably. Every time. Comfort will always be available. It is the default. The world is organized around making it easy to stay comfortable. Convenience, entertainment, ease, all abundant, all optimized, all pointing in the same direction. The question is what direction you're trying to go. Because soft is comfortable and hard is where you're going. And the more you practice the direction of hard, the less hard it feels, until eventually the couch loses its gravity, and the difficult thing is simply what you do. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Small Promises. Every promise you've broken to yourself is still in there. Your brain is keeping score. Not maliciously, not to punish you, just accurately. The brain is a pattern recognition system, and one of the patterns it tracks most carefully is the relationship between what you say and what you do. Every time those two things match, a small deposit goes in. Every time they don't, a small withdrawal. Over years of inconsistency, most people are operating from a deeply overdrawn account. and they can feel it, even when they can't name it. That feeling has a name. It's called low self-trust, and it is the single most underdiagnosed reason people can't stay consistent. Watch someone at the beginning of a new year, or a new month, or a new Monday. The energy is real. The intention is genuine. They map out the plan. Wake up at 6, exercise daily, read 30 minutes before bed, cut out the thing they know is costing them. They feel it. The version of themselves they're describing is vivid and compelling. They believe it in the moment completely. By day 4, the plan has been quietly renegotiated. By day 10, it's mostly a memory. And what replaces it isn't neutral. It's a small, quiet confirmation of a story they've been telling themselves for years. I can't stick to things. I start strong and fall apart. This is just who I am. That story is not a personality trait. It's an overdraft notice. The mechanism is straightforward once you see it. Big promises feel powerful because they describe a big future. The gap between your current self and the person in the plan is exciting, in the same way that imagining the finished product is always more exciting than the actual process of building it. But the brain doesn't experience the future. It experiences today. And today, the big promise is almost always in direct conflict with what's comfortable, familiar, and immediately available. Big promises activate big resistance. This is not weakness. It is physics. Self-trust is not built through grand declarations. It is built through a sequence of small, completed actions, each one adding evidence to a case your brain is quietly constructing about who you are. The case is built on data, not intention. Your intentions are invisible to the system. Your behavior is the only input it accepts. I've watched people design elaborate systems for themselves, detailed schedules, color-coded trackers, accountability partners, and collapse within 2 weeks because the architecture was built for the person they wanted to be, not the person they currently were. The gap wasn't laziness. The gap was overreach. They were making promises to a future self and asking the present self to fund them. The present self has limited resources. It is tired, distracted, and operating in a world full of friction. The promise needs to fit that person, not the optimized, rested, motivated version of them that appears in the plan. Shrinking the promise is not lowering your standards. It is an act of precision. You are identifying the smallest action that still moves in the right direction and making that your commitment. Not because you aren't capable of more, because you are building a structure, and structures require foundations before they require height. A commitment kept is worth more than a commitment abandoned, regardless of size. This is not inspirational framing. It is neurological fact. Every time you complete what you said you would, your brain updates its model of you. The update is small and undramatic. It doesn't feel like anything. But it is the only input that actually changes the model. Motivation doesn't update it. Inspiration doesn't update it. Watching someone else succeed doesn't update it. Only your own completed behavior, however small, moves the needle. The other thing small promises do is remove the negotiation window. Large commitments come with large resistance, which comes with a long internal argument about whether today is the right day, whether you're prepared enough, whether the conditions are suitable. That argument is the enemy. It sounds like self-awareness, but it operates like sabotage. Small commitments are beneath the argument's notice. They don't trigger the threat response. They slip past the part of the brain that hates change and land directly in the part that executes. I will meditate for 20 minutes every morning, triggers the argument. I will sit quietly for 2 minutes before I check my phone, doesn't. Both are moving in the same direction. Only one reliably happens. The compounding effect of small promises kept is not obvious in the short term. That's by design. The changes are structural, not visible. You are not watching yourself transform. You are becoming someone for whom transformation is the natural direction of travel. The difference only becomes obvious in retrospect, when you look back at who you were 12 months ago and realize you are no longer operating from the same floor. There is also something that happens to your relationship with your own voice when you start keeping small promises consistently. The internal monologue changes register. The voice that says, "I'll do it tomorrow," starts to carry less weight. Not because you silenced it, but because you stopped obeying it enough for it to matter. The voice that says, "I said I would," gets louder. Not because it's more virtuous, because it has more evidence behind it. That evidence is the entire architecture. You are not trying to become a disciplined person through willpower. You are trying to accumulate enough behavioral evidence that your brain reclassifies you as someone who follows through. Once that reclassification happens, consistency stops being a fight. It becomes the path of least resistance, because now the resistance is on the other side. Breaking the promise feels wrong. Keeping it feels like you. Start smaller than you think you should. Not as a compromise, as a strategy. The person who keeps one small promise daily for a year is not the same person who started. They are someone the original person would not recognize. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the quiet, daily accumulation of self-trust eventually becomes indistinguishable from character. Chapter 5. The Open Tab Problem. Somewhere in your head right now, there are 15 tabs open. None of them are doing anything. All of them are costing you something. Not metaphorically. The unfinished things in your life are actively consuming mental resources, processing power, background attention, low-level anxiety, every hour of every day, including the hours you're trying to rest and the hours you're trying to focus on something else entirely. You're carrying them without realizing you're carrying them. And the cumulative weight of all of it is one of the least discussed reasons people feel perpetually drained without being able to explain why. Picture a desk, not a clean one, the real kind. Stacked with half-finished projects, notes from 3 months ago, a book left open to a page that was never finished, a form that needs to be returned, a thing that needs to be emailed. The person sitting at that desk knows every single item. Not consciously. They're not thinking about the form. But some part of their brain is. It's been tracking all of it, quietly, since the moment each thing was left incomplete. Now they sit down to do something focused. They wonder why it feels like pushing through wet concrete. The cognitive phenomenon behind this has a name. Psychologist Bluma Zygarnik identified it in the 1920s. The brain maintains an active representation of unfinished tasks, and that representation keeps firing until the task is either completed or deliberately released. The brain is not being irrational. It is doing exactly what a good assistant would do, keeping active reminders of everything you said you'd get back to. The problem is, you have approximately 400 things you said you'd get back to. Most people dramatically underestimate how much of their available mental bandwidth is occupied by accumulation. They think they're tired because of what they did today. Often they're tired because of what they didn't finish last month. The unresolved sits there, humming at a frequency below conscious awareness, not loud enough to address, not quiet enough to ignore. Just loud enough to make everything else slightly harder than it should be. A few years ago, I tracked a single week of this. Every time I noticed a background pull, a thing that surfaced unbidden while I was trying to focus on something else, I wrote it down. By the end of the week, the list was long enough to be embarrassing. things I'd meant to do, respond to, decide, finish, or close that had been silently circulating for weeks. None of them urgent, all of them present. Completion is not just a practical act. It is a psychological one. When you finish something, really finish it, close the loop, draw the line, you release the cognitive hold it had on you. The brain gets to file it. The open representation closes. The background hum goes quiet. And in the space left behind, something becomes available that wasn't before. Actual mental room. The kind of room that makes focus easier and creativity possible and decisions clearer. Most people don't know what this feels like because they've never experienced it. The accumulation started early and never stopped. There has never been a moment when the desk was genuinely clear. So the baseline they're comparing against is already a baseline of accumulated weight, and they've mistaken that weight for normal. It isn't normal. It's just common. The relationship between unfinished tasks and identity runs deeper than productivity. Every incomplete thing carries a small, implicit verdict, not a loud one. Nothing as dramatic as "I failed." Just a quiet background suggestion. I am someone who leaves things unfinished. Repeated often enough, across enough domains, that suggestion calcifies into a belief. And beliefs, unlike facts, are self-confirming. You start leaving things unfinished because you believe you're someone who leaves things unfinished. The evidence and the belief feed each other in a loop that feels like personality but is actually just history. Finishing breaks the loop. Not heroically. Finishing a 3-year-old task is not a transformation, but it is data. A counterexample to the story. One more piece of evidence that you are, in fact, someone who closes things. Each piece makes the next piece more likely. The loop starts running in a different direction. There is also the matter of what incompletion does to forward motion. Unfinished things are anchors. They don't prevent movement. You can still start new things while old things remain open. But they create drag. Every new initiative you launch, while the old ones are still technically active, requires you to carry the old weight into the new territory. You're trying to build momentum while towing a barge of everything you haven't resolved. This is why starting feels easier than continuing, and continuing feels easier than finishing. Starting requires no weight. The task is new, the tab is fresh, the energy is available. Continuing requires some weight. The initial excitement has faded. The difficulty has revealed itself. Finishing requires the most. You have to push through the final resistance, which is often the highest, because the final stretch is where judgment lives. The thing will be done. It will be what it is. You can no longer protect it with the comfort of potential. That last stretch resistance is not incidental. It is structural. The closer you get to completion, the louder the internal negotiation becomes. Not because the task is getting harder, but because the stakes are getting realer. An unfinished thing can still be anything. A finished thing is exactly what it is. Finishing is, among other things, an act of courage. The practical implication is not to clear every open tab in a single weekend. That approach consistently produces a burst of momentum, followed by collapse when life reintroduces complexity. The sustainable approach is to stop adding new tabs faster than you're closing old ones, and to identify the few unfinished things carrying the most weight, and close those first. The heaviest tabs are easy to identify. They're the ones that surface most often when you're trying to do something else. The thing you avoid thinking about but think about constantly. The project that's been 90% done for 4 months. The conversation you've been meaning to have for longer than you can justify. These are not small drains. They are significant ones. Close the heaviest ones first. Feel what the desk is like with a little more room on it. Then close the next one. The goal is not an empty desk. The goal is a desk you can actually work at. Chapter 6. How to fall and not disappear. Missing one day doesn't break a habit. Deciding that missing one day means something, that's what breaks it. The habit was fine. The interpretation destroyed it. This is the part of consistency nobody wants to examine too closely. Because examining it requires admitting how much of the damage is self-inflicted. Not the lapse. The lapse is human, structural, inevitable. The damage comes from what happens in the 48 hours after the lapse, when the brain goes looking for a narrative to explain what just occurred, and finds one that is dramatic, total, and completely disproportionate to the evidence. You missed a workout. By Friday, you've decided you're someone who doesn't exercise. You ate badly at dinner. By Saturday, the diet is ruined, and you're eating like the category no longer applies to you. You skipped the habit 3 days running. By the following week, you've quietly stopped counting yourself as someone who has that habit at all. Watch this happen in real time, and it looks like self-sabotage. From the inside, it feels like honesty, like you're finally being realistic about who you are. Like the lapse revealed something true that the streak was concealing. But it didn't reveal anything. It was 3 days. The only thing that revealed something true was the story you told about it. And that story was yours to choose. The mechanism at work here is called the abstinence violation effect, and it operates with remarkable consistency across almost every domain where people try to build new behavior. The moment a rule is broken, even slightly, even once, a psychological permission structure collapses. The internal logic runs. I already broke it, so continuing to break it costs me nothing additional. One missed day becomes a missed week, not because of weakness, but because of accounting. You've already taken the loss. Why not keep spending? This is not a character flaw. It is a cognitive pattern. Patterns can be interrupted. The interruption requires one thing: speed. The faster you return, the less the story has time to harden. Stories about identity harden fast. Give them 24 hours and they feel like facts. Give them a week and they feel like history. Give them a month and you're building your next plan around them as though they were bedrock. They are not bedrock. They are interpretations. And interpretations are modifiable. I've broken streaks I was proud of and watched myself do the exact thing I'm describing. Not immediately, but within days. The momentum gone, the behavior quietly shelved, the story already half written about why this particular goal was probably unrealistic anyway. The lapse wasn't the problem. The 2-day delay in returning was. That delay was enough for the narrative to calcify. And once it calcified, it became the thing I was fighting instead of the original habit. Quick returns are not dramatic. This is important. The temptation after a lapse is to treat the return as a restart, to rebuild the energy, recommit publicly, redesign the system, relaunch with appropriate ceremony. All of that is displacement activity. It feels like discipline and functions like avoidance. You're postponing the actual return in favor of preparing for the return. The preparation becomes the procrastination. Return without ceremony. Do the small thing you missed, not the full version, the smallest viable version. If you missed a run, walk around the block. If you missed writing, write 1 sentence. If you missed the morning routine, do 60 seconds of it. The content is almost irrelevant. What matters is the behavioral signal. I came back. The identity is intact. The story doesn't get to end here. That signal, sent quickly and without drama, is more valuable than any amount of renewed motivation. The shame spiral deserves its own examination because it is the primary mechanism that turns a single lapse into a full collapse, and it is almost never recognized as such. Shame presents as accountability. It feels responsible. It feels like the appropriate response to having failed a standard you set for yourself. You take it seriously because you're a serious person, and serious people feel bad when they fall short. But shame is not accountability. Accountability is clear-eyed, forward-facing, and asks, what happened? What needs to change? What's the next action? Shame is backward-facing, identity-level, and asks, what does this say about me? One of those questions leads somewhere useful. The other leads into a loop that has no exit, because no answer is ever satisfying enough to make the shame stop. You cannot think your way out of a shame spiral. You can only act your way out. And the action required is the exact behavior the shame is telling you you're incapable of. This is the structure of the trap. The shame is loudest right before the return. The return is hardest when the shame is loudest. Most people read this sequence as confirmation that they're not ready yet, that they need to feel differently before they can act. They don't. They need to act in order to feel differently. The sequence runs in the direction of behavior, not emotion. Failure is not symmetric. A single lapse does not undo an equivalent amount of progress. 10 days of consistent behavior, followed by 1 day off, does not put you at day 0. The neural pathways built over those 10 days still exist. The self-trust deposited over those 10 days still exists. The identity shift, however partial, still exists. None of it evaporates because you missed a day. It only evaporates if you decide the miss is large enough to render all of it void. That decision is always yours. There will be lapses, not might be, will be. Life is not a controlled environment where your system gets to run without interference. Things go wrong. Weeks collapse. Circumstances override intentions. The question was never whether you'd fall. The question was always how long you'd stay down. People who build lasting consistency are not people who never break. They are people who have developed a relationship with returning. Returning quickly, returning without ceremony, returning without requiring themselves to feel ready first. The return is the discipline, not the streak. The streak is just what the return looks like from the outside, accumulated over time. Keep the streak when you can. Return when you can't. The difference between those two things is smaller than the shame wants you to believe. Chapter 7. The edge is the point. The moment you want to stop is not the end of the workout. It's the beginning of it. Everything before that moment was preparation. The warm-up, the first sets, the comfortable stretch of effort where your body was moving but not yet being asked for anything. It doesn't already know how to give. That part builds maintenance. The moment you want to quit, that specific moment, that precise internal negotiation where some part of you starts calculating the cost of continuing, that's where adaptation lives. That's the address of growth, and almost everyone leaves right before they get there. Picture a runner at mile 8 of a 10-mile route. Not injured, not depleted in any dangerous way. Just tired and bored and aware that the car is parked 2 miles back and the couch exists and dinner is a thing that happens in the evenings. The body has more. The mind is already writing the story about why stopping is reasonable. By the time the story has 3 sentences, it feels like a decision that was made for good reasons. It wasn't a decision. It was a negotiation the mind held with itself and declared a winner before the other side got to speak. The other side, the part that could have continued, didn't lose because it was wrong. It lost because it was slower. Your brain's quit signal is not a report on your actual capacity. It is a forecast based on historical behavior, specifically on what you've done the last time this feeling appeared. If the last 20 times you felt this way you stopped, the brain has learned that this feeling means stop. It will fire that signal earlier each time, with increasing confidence, because you've been confirming it. You've been teaching the system that this is the threshold. This is the edge. Past here, we don't go. The edge is not fixed. This is the part that changes everything. Every time you go past the signal, you recalibrate it. Not dramatically. You don't suddenly become someone who can endure anything, but slightly, reliably, cumulatively. The threshold moves outward. The signal starts firing later. What felt like your limit last month is now somewhere in the middle of the effort range. Your capacity didn't change. Your brain's model of your capacity changed. And since your behavior follows the model, not the actual capacity, the model is the thing that matters. This is why people who consistently push past discomfort seem to exist in a different category from everyone else. They are not built differently. They have been teaching their internal model different things. Every push was a lesson. Every lesson moved the threshold. Over years, the threshold has moved so far out that what used to feel like the edge now feels like warm-up. Not because the work got easier, because the model got recalibrated. The quit signal, once you understand what it actually is, becomes useful information rather than a command. It tells you, you are at the edge of your current model. What you do here determines whether the model expands or stays fixed. That's all it is. Not a verdict, not a recommendation. A location marker. You are here. Growth is one step past here. The signal is the map. Acting quickly when the signal fires is the key variable. The longer you sit with the urge to quit, the longer you allow the internal negotiation to run, the more elaborate the justifications become. And justifications for quitting are not stupid. They are creative, context-sensitive, and often partially true. Yes, rest is important. Yes, you've already done a lot today. Yes, one day off won't hurt. All true in isolation. All weaponized by a brain that has decided, below the level of conscious deliberation, that stopping is the preferred outcome. Don't negotiate, move, not dramatically. You don't need to grit your teeth and summon some heroic reserve. Just continue for one more unit, one more minute, one more rep, one more paragraph. The unit size is almost irrelevant. The act of continuing past the signal is what matters. The behavioral message sent to the system that this threshold is not, in fact, the limit. I remember the specific session where this became concrete for me. I was 40 minutes into something I'd committed to an hour of, and the urge to stop arrived with unusual clarity. Not physical, mental. The clean, reasonable thought. You've done enough. This is sufficient. Stopping now is fine. I almost obeyed it. Instead, I stayed for the next 10 minutes doing something I can only describe as watching myself want to leave while remaining anyway. The 10 minutes were not heroic. They were slightly tedious. But when I finished, I felt something that was not pride exactly, more like information. The signal had fired. I hadn't obeyed it. The system noted that. The next session, the signal fired later. Not much later, but later. There is a specific quality to the discomfort at the edge that distinguishes it from discomfort that actually means something. Real warning signals. Pain that indicates injury, exhaustion that indicates genuine depletion, stress that indicates a system genuinely overwhelmed. have a different character than the quit signal. They are specific, located, escalating, and don't respond to being ignored. The quit signal is general, narrative, and dissipates remarkably quickly once you've committed to continuing. The brain stops arguing the moment the argument is clearly lost. Learn to tell the difference, and you gain access to a very large amount of capacity that was always available, but cordoned off by a model that hadn't been updated recently. Most people never find out what they're actually capable of, not because they lack the physical or cognitive capacity, but because their internal model was set years ago by a younger, less experienced version of themselves, and nobody ever challenged it hard enough for long enough to force an update. The model is conservative by design. It is trying to protect you. It does not want you to discover that you're capable of more, because more means risk, and risk means potential failure. And potential failure is the thing the whole system was built to prevent. The brain is not your enemy. It is just optimizing for the wrong variable. Safety over growth, familiar over possible. Your job is to keep updating the model, one push at a time, one ignored quit signal at a time. Not dramatically, not heroically, just consistently. The edge moves every time you go past it. Go past it today. The version of you with a different model is not waiting for a better moment. It is waiting for the moment you stop obeying the signal. That moment is now. It will also be the next time you feel it, and the time after that. Chapter 8. You cannot delete a habit. Your brain does not have a delete key. This is not a motivational metaphor. It is a structural fact about how neural architecture works, and misunderstanding it is responsible for the failure of virtually every behavior change effort that starts with the words, "I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop checking my phone first thing. I'm going to stop eating late. I'm going to stop procrastinating, overthinking, defaulting to the path of least resistance when things get difficult." All of these are the same category of error. They are attempts to create absence in a system that does not do absence. The brain builds pathways. It does not unbuild them. What looks like a deleted habit from the outside is always on the inside, a pathway that stopped being used, which is a completely different thing, requiring a completely different approach. Watch someone try to quit a habit through willpower alone. Day one is fine. Motivation is high. The decision feels recent and real. The resistance hasn't fully organized yet. Day 3 is harder. The trigger appears. The familiar pull activates. The brain starts looking for its expected response and finds a gap. Day 7, the motivation has faded, but the trigger is still firing at full strength, because triggers don't fade with time the way motivation does. By day 10, the person has either relapsed or is running entirely on grinding, exhausting suppression, white-knuckling their way past a pull that hasn't weakened at all, because nothing has been done to weaken it. The pull hasn't weakened because they're fighting it, not replacing it. Here is the actual architecture. Every habit consists of 3 components: a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue is the trigger, a time of day, an emotional state, an environmental signal. The routine is the behavior. The reward is what the behavior delivers. The brain links all 3 into a loop that, once established, runs automatically when the cue appears. It does not consult you. It does not ask permission. It fires. When you try to eliminate a habit by removing the routine without addressing the cue or the reward, you create a broken loop. The cue still fires. The reward is still expected. The routine is absent. The brain doesn't conclude that the loop is over. It concludes that something is wrong and begins searching urgently for a way to complete the pattern. The urgency is what people experience as craving. It is not weakness. It is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, completing established patterns. The solution is not suppression. The solution is substitution. Keep the cue, keep the reward, change the routine. Give the loop a new middle section that delivers something similar enough to the original reward that the brain accepts the trade. Not identical, similar. The brain is not a precise instrument in this regard. It is looking for the category of reward, not the exact reward. Stress relief, stimulation, distraction, social connection. Whatever the original habit was delivering, identify that, and then find a behavior that delivers something in the same neighborhood. The replacement doesn't need to be virtuous. It needs to be functional. Replacing a stress-eating loop with a brief walk is not about the walk being healthy. It's about the walk delivering enough of the stress relief signal that the brain accepts it as completing the loop. Over time, with repetition, the new routine becomes what the cue expects. The old routine doesn't disappear. It becomes the road less traveled, still there, still theoretically accessible, but increasingly unfamiliar. Pathways weaken through disuse. They do not vanish. This distinction matters. A habit you had 10 years ago and haven't engaged in since is still in there, dormant, waiting for sufficient cue activation to fire again. People who quit smoking for years and relapse under stress are not experiencing a new habit forming. They are experiencing an old pathway reactivating under the precise conditions that always activated it. The stress is the cue. The cue still works. It was never deleted. This is why environmental design is not optional in habit replacement. The cue is often environmental, and if the environment doesn't change, the cue keeps firing at full strength, making the replacement harder every time. Remove the cue where possible. Change the environment that delivers it. Make the trigger less frequent while the new pathway is still fragile. You are not trying to be stronger than the old loop. You are trying to make the new loop stronger than the old one. I spent a long time trying to change a particular evening pattern through decision-making alone. Every evening, the same cue appeared. A specific kind of tiredness combined with the particular quality of light at a certain hour. And the old routine fired before I'd consciously registered the cue. By the time I knew what was happening, I was already mid-pattern. The decision point I thought I had wasn't where I imagined it. It was earlier. Before the cue fired, not after. The intervention had to happen upstream. Change what the cue encountered, not what I did after the cue had already activated the loop. There is also an identity dimension to habit replacement that operates in parallel with the mechanical one. The old habit is not just a behavior, it is part of a self-concept. I'm someone who does this. Replacing the behavior without updating the identity creates instability. The new behavior sits on top of an identity that doesn't support it, like new furniture in a room that was designed for different furniture. It can work temporarily. Under stress, the room reasserts itself. The identity update happens through repetition of the new behavior, which is why the replacement needs to be consistent enough, for long enough, that the brain starts updating its model. Each repetition is a small vote for a new self-concept. The old self-concept doesn't lose in a dramatic moment of transformation. It loses in the accumulation of unremarkable moments where the new behavior showed up and the old one didn't. Unremarkable is the key word. The replacement process is not interesting. It does not feel like progress while it's happening. The pathway is being rebuilt one traversal at a time, below the threshold of conscious awareness, in the same quiet way that a path forms in a field, not through a single deliberate act of construction, but through the accumulated evidence of feet moving in the same direction, repeatedly, until the grass stops growing there. You don't delete old paths, you grow new ones, and use them until they're the ones that feel like home. Chapter 9. The Private Standard. The version of you that shows up when no one is watching is your real resume, not the version you present, not the one that performs well under observation, delivers when stakes are visible, rises to occasions because occasions have witnesses. That version is real too, but it is downstream of the private one. What you do in public is a lagged indicator of what you've been doing in private. The gap between those two things is either closing or widening every day, based on choices that nobody will ever see or acknowledge or give you credit for. Most people have never examined this gap honestly. It requires a particular kind of uncomfortable self-honesty, sitting with the question of what your actual private behavior looks like, stripped of the performance, without the version of yourself you'd prefer to be seeing. Not who you are when someone is counting on you, who you are when nobody is. Picture two people with identical public outputs. Same results, same reputation, same apparent level of discipline from the outside. One of them is working hard in private. The other is sprinting to catch up whenever visibility creates pressure, then coasting in the spaces between. From the outside, indistinguishable. From the inside, completely different structures. One has a foundation, the other has a performance. And the moment conditions shift, stress increases, motivation drops, external accountability disappears, the structures reveal themselves, the foundation holds, the performance collapses. External accountability is not useless. Telling someone about your goals, joining a group, creating public stakes, all of these increase short-term follow-through. The research on this is clear enough, but external accountability has a ceiling, and the ceiling is the moment when the external pressure isn't present. What happens then is a direct readout of your private standard. If the private standard is low, you coast. If the private standard is high, you continue. The external system cannot raise the private standard. It can only mask a low one temporarily. This is why people cycle through accountability structures without building lasting consistency. They find a system that works, a coach, a partner, a public commitment, and they perform well inside that system. Then the system ends, or the partner disappears, or life makes the public commitment irrelevant, and they're back to exactly where they started. Because what they built was compliance with external pressure, not internal standard. The pressure leaves, the behavior leaves with it. Internal standard works differently. It doesn't require the presence of external conditions to activate. It runs on its own logic, a logic built from private behavior accumulated over time, until the standard itself becomes the thing you're accountable to. Not a person, not a system. A version of yourself that has certain expectations and whose disappointment you would rather avoid than any external consequence. I've had periods where external accountability was abundant. People watching, stakes visible, structure provided. And I've noticed that the quality of my private behavior during those periods was worse than during periods when I was working entirely alone. Something about the external structure created a subtle permission to relax in the unseen moments. The gap was being covered by the performance, so the gap stopped bothering me. When the external structure went away, the gap was all there was. The private standard is built in unglamorous increments. The decision to do the full version of something when the abbreviated version would have been acceptable to everyone who might judge it. The choice to continue past the minimum when nobody would know you stopped. The maintenance of a commitment on a day when circumstances would have excused abandoning it. None of these feel significant in the moment. They are deeply significant structurally. Each one adds a layer to the foundation that the public performance will eventually rest on. There is a particular quality of self-respect that only comes from private discipline. It is distinct from the self-respect that comes from achievement, recognition, or external validation. Those are real, but they're contingent. They depend on outcomes, on other people's responses, on things you can't fully control. The self-respect that comes from private discipline is unconditional. It doesn't require a result. It exists because of what you did when it would have been easy to do less. That quality of self-respect is weatherproof. It remains intact when outcomes disappoint, when recognition doesn't arrive, when the public performance falls short of what you hoped. It exists independent of results, because it was never about results. It was about who you decided to be in the moments that didn't count for anything except your own standard. Most people underestimate how much the private hours determine the quality of the public ones. Not just in output terms, in presence terms. The person who shows up having done the private work carries something in their bearing that people sense without being able to articulate. There's a groundedness, a lack of internal noise, a capacity for full engagement that simply isn't available to the person who's been coasting in the invisible hours. The private work doesn't just produce better output, it produces a better quality of presence in whatever they're doing. The private standard also determines how you behave under pressure. Pressure reveals the foundation, not the performance. When conditions get difficult, when fatigue accumulates, when stakes rise, when circumstances stop cooperating, you fall to the level of your private practice, not your public aspirations. If the private practice is solid, pressure produces performance. If the private practice is hollow, pressure produces collapse. You don't rise to the occasion. You settle to the floor of what you've actually been doing when the room is empty. This is not pessimistic. It is precise. It tells you exactly where to put the work. Not into impression management. Not into public accountability structures. Into the private hours. Into the decisions that nobody is counting. In the spaces where no one is watching. In the moments when doing less would have been accepted by everyone, except the version of you that's keeping the actual score. That version is always watching. It never leaves. It is, in the end, the only audience that matters, because it is the only one with complete information about the gap between who you present and who you actually are. Close the gap in private. The public results take care of themselves. Chapter 10. Repetition is not boredom, it's proof. The reason your progress keeps disappearing is that you keep abandoning it the moment it stops feeling like progress. That's the whole explanation. Not lack of discipline, not wrong system, not insufficient motivation. You built something real. It stopped producing the feeling of building, and you interpreted the absence of that feeling as evidence that the building had stopped. It hadn't. You just couldn't feel it anymore. So you left, right before the compound interest arrived, and went looking for something that would give you the feeling back. The feeling is a liar, not always, but specifically about this. Watch someone 3 weeks into a new habit. The first week was electric. Everything felt different. The identity shift was palpable. The results were immediate and visible. Week 2, still good. The system was working. The momentum was real. The new behavior was becoming familiar. Week 3, and this is the week that matters, nothing. The behavior happens. No particular feeling accompanies it. No surge of pride, no sense of transformation, no evidence that anything significant is occurring. Just the thing. Done. Same as yesterday, same as the day before. Most people read week 3 as stagnation. It is the opposite of stagnation. Week 3 is when the behavior is transitioning from effort to architecture, from something you do to something you are. The absence of feeling is not the absence of progress. It is the signal that progress has gone underground, into the structural layer, where the real and lasting changes happen. You can't feel infrastructure being built. You can only feel it later, when everything rests on it. The brain habituates. This is a feature, not a malfunction. Novelty produces strong signals, dopamine, attention, the heightened sense of engagement that accompanies new experience. Repetition produces quieter signals, because the brain has learned the pattern and no longer needs to fire at full volume to process it. The loud feelings of early progress are the brain paying close attention to something unfamiliar. The quiet of later consistency is the brain having incorporated the behavior into its model of normal. Normal doesn't feel exciting. Normal is the goal. The problem is that most people are addicted to the loud phase. They've built their entire relationship with self-improvement around the feeling of beginning, the clarity of a new decision, the energy of a fresh start, the particular satisfaction of mapping out what's possible. That feeling is real, and it is useful, and it lasts approximately 10 to 14 days before the behavior enters the quiet phase. At which point they conclude the approach isn't working and begin again. Beginning again restores the loud phase. It feels like recommitting. It is actually cycling. I've caught myself doing this with enough frequency to recognize the specific texture of the rationalizations. The system needs refining. The approach wasn't quite right. I've learned what I needed from this version. Now I can design a better one. All partially true. All serving the same function, returning to the beginning, where it feels like something. The only way past this pattern is to develop a different relationship with ordinary days. Not to make ordinary days exciting. That project fails immediately, because ordinary days are ordinary by definition, and no reframing survives contact with the actual experience of them. But to understand what ordinary days are actually doing, structurally, below the threshold of feeling. Every ordinary day of consistent behavior is laying track, not dramatic track. No single day changes the direction of anything. But the track accumulates. Each day the path extends slightly further, the neural architecture deepens slightly. The self-concept updates by a fraction too small to detect. Weeks of this produce nothing visible. Months produce something noticeable. Years produce someone unrecognizable from who they were at the beginning. Not because of any particular moment, but because of the accumulated weight of unremarkable days that kept going. The ordinary day is the unit of transformation. Not the breakthrough. Not the peak experience. Not the week when everything clicked. The Tuesday when you did the thing even though nothing about it felt meaningful or important. There is something else happening in the repetition that isn't about neuroscience or habit architecture. It is about the relationship you develop with your own word. Every time you show up on an ordinary day, not inspired, not energized, not particularly committed in the emotional sense, you are demonstrating to yourself that your commitment is not contingent on feeling. That distinction is enormous. Contingent commitment looks like discipline, but collapses under any pressure that removes the feeling. Non-contingent commitment is rarer and far more durable. It runs on identity rather than emotion, and identity is much harder to erode than motivation. The people who built something lasting did not do so through intensity. They did it through maintenance. The athlete who runs every day regardless of weather is not more motivated than you on the days they run in rain. They are simply operating from a different baseline assumption, that the run is not optional, that the conditions are not relevant inputs, that consistency is the non-negotiable and everything else is a variable. That assumption was not installed at birth. It was built through repeated ordinary days until it became the default. Your foundations, the specific behaviors that support your energy, focus, and capacity, need to be treated the same way. Not as tools you use when inspired, or structures you maintain when life cooperates. As infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't get a day off because conditions are inconvenient. Infrastructure runs continuously, which is the only reason it can be relied upon. The moment you start treating your foundations as optional, they begin degrading. Not immediately. The first skipped day costs almost nothing. The second costs slightly more. The third begins the recalibration process. The brain noting that this behavior is apparently not as non-negotiable as previously modeled, and adjusting its expectation accordingly. By the time you notice the degradation, it is already structural. You're not rebuilding from where you left off. You're rebuilding from a foundation that has weakened in your absence. Daily maintenance of what works is not a failure of ambition. It is the precondition for every ambitious thing you want to build on top of it. Return to your foundations on boring days, especially on boring days. The boring day is not a test of whether your system is interesting. It is proof that your system doesn't require interesting. It runs anyway, it shows up anyway, it produces the track even when laying the track produces nothing worth feeling. That's not discipline fighting against boredom. That's discipline having already won. The win doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly in ordinary moments until the day you look back and realize you are entirely different from the person who needed to feel something in order to show up. That person needed the feeling. You just need the day. Chapter 11. The identity ceiling. You can build a disciplined routine on top of an identity that doesn't believe in it. It just won't last. The routine will hold for a while. Weeks, sometimes months. Long enough to feel like you've solved something. Long enough to start telling people about it. Long enough to mistake the temporary scaffolding for permanent structure. And then something shifts. A hard week, a disruption. A period of stress that doesn't leave room for maintenance. The routine breaks, as routines do. And instead of returning, which by now you know how to do, you feel a strange, quiet relief, as though the routine had been slightly foreign all along, as though the version of you maintaining it was performing a role rather than inhabiting one. That relief is diagnostic. It tells you the identity work wasn't done. Behavior sits on top of identity the way a building sits on a foundation. You can construct impressive floors on a weak foundation. The construction is real. The floors are real. But the foundation is doing quiet structural work the whole time, either supporting the height or limiting it. Most people never examine the foundation because the floors look fine. They don't look fine to the foundation. The identity ceiling is the height at which your behavior consistently stalls. You've probably noticed yours. There's a level of discipline you can reach, a particular quality of consistency, a specific regularity of output, that you hit and then, reliably, cannot sustain past. You breach it briefly during high motivation periods. You fall back below it when conditions normalize. The ceiling isn't random, it's structural. It is set by the self-concept you're operating from, the running description your brain maintains of who you are and what someone like you does. Self-concept is not passive, it is actively regulatory. The brain continuously monitors your behavior and compares it against the self-model. And when the two diverge significantly, when you're consistently acting in ways that contradict who you believe yourself to be, it generates pressure toward realignment. That pressure doesn't feel like identity maintenance. It feels like fatigue or restlessness or the vague sense that you've been trying too hard and deserve a break. It is the system trying to return you to the floor your identity set for you. This is not pathology. It is the same mechanism that prevents you from acting out of character in negative directions, from being cruel when you think of yourself as kind, or dishonest when you think of yourself as principled. The self-concept enforces consistency in all directions. The problem is when the floor of the self-concept is set lower than your actual capacity. Most people's self-concepts were set during periods they'd rather forget. Adolescence mostly. When the feedback was inconsistent, the environment was often unsupportive, and the conclusions drawn about personal capacity were based on incomplete evidence gathered by someone who didn't yet have the tools to evaluate it properly. Those conclusions became the foundation. And because the brain is conservative about updating core self-beliefs, the foundation has persisted long past the period that generated it. You are still, in significant ways, operating from an identity formed by a younger, less experienced, less capable version of yourself. Not entirely. Life updates the model, experience revises it, success and failure both contribute data. But the deep structure persists. And the deep structure is what sets the ceiling. A colleague of mine spent 3 years building and rebuilding the same fitness routine. The pattern was consistent: 6 to 8 weeks of real discipline, followed by complete abandonment, followed by a restart 4 to 6 months later. The behavior was indistinguishable each time. Same structure, same initial results, same collapse. We spent a long time looking at the behavioral layer, the system design, the habit architecture, the environmental factors, before the actual issue surfaced. He did not think of himself as a physically disciplined person. At a level below conscious articulation, he carried a self-concept in which consistent physical discipline was something other people did. His kind of person tried and eventually stopped. He'd been confirming that identity with clockwork regularity for 3 years without knowing the identity was the variable. Updating the self-concept requires different inputs than updating a habit. Habits change through repetition of behavior. Self-concepts change through the interpretation of behavior. Specifically, through consciously and repeatedly treating your own actions as evidence of a new identity rather than exceptions to the old one. This sounds simple. It requires genuine deliberateness because the brain's default is to interpret new behavior as anomalous, as a temporary departure from normal rather than the beginning of a new normal. You did the hard thing today. The brain files it as good day. You did it again tomorrow. Filed as good streak. You do it for 3 weeks. Filed as unusually good period. The reclassification from anomaly to identity requires you to actively feed the reinterpretation, not affirmations, evidence. This is who I am now. This is what someone like me does. The behavior is not the exception. The behavior is the baseline. Every action that matches the new identity is a vote. The votes don't change the outcome immediately. Identity updates require supermajority, accumulated over time. But the votes are real, and the only way to lose is to stop casting them. The ceiling is not permanent. It is a model that hasn't been updated yet. Update the model, and the ceiling lifts. Not because you became more capable. You were always more capable. Because the structure that was quietly limiting the expression of that capacity finally caught up with it. The behavior was never the problem. The story underneath it was. Change the story with evidence, not with intention. Intention without evidence is just a wish. Evidence without intention is just history. But evidence interpreted deliberately, consistently, in service of a new self-concept, that is identity construction. That is the work underneath the work. Do the thing. Then tell yourself the right story about what the thing means. Both halves are required. Most people only do one. Chapter 12. The Comparison Trap. Someone else's year 3 is not your year 1, but your brain keeps trying to make it a fair comparison. It does this automatically, instantly, and without your permission. You see the output, the finished work, the visible discipline, the apparent ease with which someone operates at a level you're still fighting to reach, and something in your evaluation system registers a gap. Not neutrally. The gap arrives preloaded with interpretation. They have something you don't. They figured out something you haven't. The distance between where they are and where you are is meaningful information about your relative capacity. It is not meaningful information about your relative capacity. It is a snapshot of two people at completely different points in a nonlinear process, interpreted as though they're competing in the same race at the same moment. Picture someone 6 weeks into learning an instrument, watching a video of someone who has been playing for 11 years. The 11-year player makes it look frictionless, fingers moving without apparent thought, the music emerging as though the instrument is simply an extension of intention. The 6-week player watches this and feels something that is not quite discouragement and not quite envy, but contains elements of both. A quiet sense that the gap is not just current, but possibly fundamental. That the ease the 11-year player displays is not the product of 11 years. It's the product of being a different kind of person. This interpretation is almost universal. It is also completely wrong. What the 6-week player is seeing is not talent. They are seeing the accumulated invisibility of 10,000 hours of practice that produced a fluency so complete, it no longer looks like practice. The friction was there. The awkwardness was there. The specific discouragement of being 6 weeks in and watching someone advanced. That was there too, in the early stages of the person they're now comparing themselves to. None of it is visible in the current output. Outputs don't carry their own history. Social comparison is cognitively irresistible because it's one of the primary mechanisms through which humans have always calibrated their standing and directed their development. Knowing where you are relative to others in your group is useful information. The problem is that the mechanism evolved for small, local, relatively homogeneous groups, communities where the people you were comparing yourself to were at similar life stages, operating under similar constraints, working with similar resources. That calibration system is now running in an environment of global visibility, curated outputs, and infinite sample size. It was not designed for this. It is catastrophically miscalibrated for it. You are comparing your internal experience, the doubt, the effort, the slow days, the full unfiltered reality of your own process, against other people's external outputs, which are the curated highlights of their best work, stripped of the internal experience that produced them. The comparison is not between you and them. It is between your reality and their performance. You will lose this comparison every time, not because you're behind, but because the comparison itself is structurally rigged. I spent a significant stretch of time with a clear awareness that a specific person in my field was operating at a higher level than I was. I knew it intellectually. They'd been doing it longer, had built something real, deserved the recognition they had. But that intellectual knowledge did not prevent the comparison from running. Every output of theirs that I encountered recalibrated my sense of what was possible for me. Downward, not upward. Not as inspiration. As evidence of a gap I had no clear path to closing. What I was missing was timeline. I was looking at the gap as a static fact rather than a dynamic that had been in motion for years before I was aware of it. The gap wasn't a verdict on capacity. It was a measurement of head start. The functional damage comparison does to consistency is specific. It attacks the feedback loop. Consistency requires a feedback loop that registers your own progress accurately, that treats your movement as meaningful relative to your own baseline, rather than meaningless relative to someone else's position. When comparison dominates the feedback loop, your own progress becomes invisible. You moved forward, but they're still further ahead, so the movement doesn't register as movement. It registers as insufficient movement. And insufficient movement, sustained over time, produces the same motivational outcome as no movement. The sense that the effort isn't working, that the gap isn't closing, that something fundamental is wrong with the approach. Nothing is wrong with the approach. The measuring stick is wrong. Your baseline is the only legitimate reference point for your progress. Not where you want to be. Not where someone else is. Where you were. Last month, last year, 3 years ago. The question that produces accurate feedback is never how far am I from them. It is always how far am I from who I used to be. That question has an honest answer. The honest answer is almost always further than I give myself credit for. There is a specific kind of damage that comes from comparing yourself to people at a fundamentally different stage and concluding that their pace is the correct pace and yours is deficient. It produces a chronic state of artificial urgency, the feeling that you are behind a schedule that was never yours, falling short of a timeline that was never established for you, failing to meet a standard that was set by someone else's trajectory applied to your own. This urgency does not accelerate progress. It degrades it. Urgency born from comparison produces rushed, anxious, poorly grounded action, the opposite of the patient, consistent, structurally sound behavior that actually closes gaps. Rushing toward someone else's position is not the same as moving toward your own destination. They can look identical from the outside and produce completely different results, because one is calibrated to your actual path and the other is calibrated to someone else's. The sustainable response to comparison is not to stop noticing. You will notice. The mechanism runs too deep to be disabled by intention. The sustainable response is to change what you do with the noticing. Instead of letting the observed gap become a referendum on your capacity, use it as a data point about what's possible over time. Someone at year 10 looked like you at year 1. They do not look like you at year 10 because they are different. They look like that because year 10 looks different from year 1, and year 10 is available to anyone who doesn't stop before they get there. The person you're comparing yourself to is not your competition. They are a preview, a rough, non-transferable, timeline-independent preview of what sustained consistency produces. The preview is useful for one thing, demonstrating that the destination exists. Everything else about the comparison is noise. Use the noise as a compass, not a verdict. It's pointing towards something real. You just have to stop treating their mile 10 as evidence about your mile 1. Chapter 13. When consistency becomes character. At some point, the discipline disappears. Not because you stopped, because it became unnecessary. This sounds like a reward. It is more than that. It is a structural transformation. The moment when the scaffolding that held the building up during construction becomes redundant because the building is now holding itself. The effort that was required to maintain the behavior is no longer required. Not because the behavior stopped happening, but because it stopped being a behavior you maintain and became a behavior you simply have. The distinction is enormous. Maintaining something requires continuous input. Having something just requires not losing it, which costs almost nothing. Most people don't know this transition is possible because they've never stayed long enough to experience it. They've seen the early phase, the effortful, deliberate, requires conscious decision phase, and concluded that phase is the permanent state of discipline. That consistency will always feel like pushing. That the people who appear effortless are either lying about the effort or built differently. Neither is true. They stayed long enough for the transition to happen. That's the entire explanation. Picture someone who has run every morning for 6 years. Ask them about motivation, and they'll look at you with something close to confusion. Not because they're above the question, because the question no longer applies to their situation. Motivation is a variable that influences decisions. The run stopped being a decision years ago. It is simply what happens in the morning, in the same category as getting dressed or making coffee. The absence of the run would be the notable event. Its presence requires no more decision than breathing. That is not a special kind of person. That is what 6 years of consistent behavior produces in any person. The transition doesn't announce itself. There is no morning where you wake up and realize the effort has gone. It leaves gradually, the way light leaves an evening, continuously, below the threshold of moment-to-moment perception, until you look up and notice it's dark, without being able to identify when the darkness started. One day you complete the behavior and realize you didn't think about whether to do it. You just did it. The deliberation that used to occupy the decision was absent, not suppressed, absent. It had nothing to deliberate about. This absence is the signal. The behavior has crossed from the effortful layer into the identity layer. It is no longer something you do. It is something you are. What produces this transition is not a special technique or an insight or a threshold of motivation finally reached. It is repetition past the point where the brain stops treating the behavior as novel. Past the point where the self-concept updates to incorporate the behavior as definitional. Past the point where skipping it would feel like a departure from normal rather than a return to it. The transition requires enough repetitions that the behavior becomes load-bearing in the architecture of your identity, something the self-model depends on rather than merely accommodates. The number of repetitions required is not fixed. It varies by person, by behavior, by how deeply the behavior conflicts with the prior self-concept. For some things and some people, the transition happens in months. For others, in years. The variable that matters most is not speed, but continuity. Unbroken enough that the brain never gets to reclassify the behavior as discontinued, never gets to move it from active identity to inactive history. I can tell you the exact texture of this from the inside, because I've experienced the before and after in the same domain, and the difference is not subtle. Before the transition, every instance of the behavior involved a small negotiation, not always conscious, often barely noticeable, but present. A micro-decision that landed on yes, but was still a decision. After the transition, the negotiation is simply not there. The behavior happens in the same way that habitual behaviors happen, without consulting the deliberative system, without requiring a vote. The deliberative system is freed for other things. You have more cognitive bandwidth available because a behavior that used to cost mental energy now costs essentially none. This is the compound interest that nobody talks about when they talk about consistency. The return is not just the behavior itself, the run, the work, the practice, the discipline maintained. The return includes the cognitive and emotional resources freed when the behavior stops requiring active management. People who have built multiple behaviors to the identity level are not superhuman in their capacity. They've simply converted effortful costs into structural features, freeing bandwidth that used to be consumed by maintenance. The character that emerges from this process is not a performed character. It is not someone who has decided to be disciplined and works constantly to maintain that decision. It is someone for whom certain behaviors are simply true, factual about who they are, in the way that having brown eyes is factual, not a choice they renew each morning. The consistency is not an achievement they're protecting. It is a quality they possess, the way a person possesses a temperament. This is worth sitting with, because it changes the nature of the project entirely. If the goal is to become someone who maintains consistency through ongoing effort, the project is infinite and exhausting. The effort is permanent, the vigilance is permanent, the possibility of collapse is permanent. But if the goal is to become someone for whom certain behaviors are constitutive of identity, not maintained but simply had, then the project has an endpoint, not a final destination where everything is solved, but a transition point where the nature of what's required changes fundamentally. Past that transition point, the relevant question is no longer, how do I make myself do this? The relevant question becomes, what do I do with someone who does this automatically? The capacity is now a given. What gets built on top of it is the next territory. The people you most admire for their consistency are not in a permanent act of discipline. They are on the far side of a transition you haven't crossed yet. The crossing required nothing you don't have. It required time and repetitions, and the decision not to stop before the scaffolding became redundant. There is one final thing worth saying, and it is the thing this entire book has been moving toward. The consistency was never the point. It was the method. The point was always who you become when you stop stopping. Not the habits, not the system, not the structure. The person those things slowly and quietly assemble. Someone who trusts their own word. Someone whose private behavior matches their public intentions. Someone who no longer requires external conditions to be favorable before they show up. That person was always available. They were just on the other side of enough ordinary days. You know what the ordinary days require now. You know what they're building. The only remaining question is how many of them you're willing to show up for. Show up for enough of them, and the question answers itself. Because at some point you stop choosing to show up and simply are someone who does. That's the whole game. Everything else was explanation. Chapter 14. The relapse you didn't see coming. You didn't quit. You just kept making one small exception, and then another, until the exceptions became the routine. This is the collapse nobody warns you about. Not the dramatic failure. The visible, dateable moment where something broke and you know exactly what happened and when. That version of failure is almost useful. It has a clear edge. You can point to it, examine it, understand what went wrong, and build a return around it. The collapse worth fearing is quieter. It has no edge. It happens in increments so small that each one feels like a reasonable accommodation rather than a departure, until one day you look up and realize you are nowhere near where you were, and you cannot identify a single moment where you made the decision to leave. You didn't make the decision. You made 30 small decisions that together added up to the decision you would never have consciously made. Picture someone 8 months into a discipline they're genuinely proud of. The foundation is solid. The behavior is established. The identity has started to update. Then life introduces a variable, a demanding project, a disrupted schedule, a week that legitimately doesn't allow for the full version of the practice. They adapt. They do the abbreviated version. This is correct. This is the intelligent response. The abbreviated version is better than nothing, and nothing would have been the alternative. The problem is the next week, when the demanding project is over and the schedule has cleared, the abbreviated version runs again. Not because conditions require it, because it has become the path of least resistance, and the brain, which is always optimizing for efficiency, has quietly accepted the new lower floor as the updated standard. The week after, the abbreviated version runs again. The week after that, it runs 2 out of 5 days instead of 5. Each step feels like a small thing. The accumulation is a full retreat. This is drift, and drift is almost impossible to detect from inside it. The reason drift is so difficult to catch is that the brain normalizes continuously. Whatever your recent behavior has been becomes the implicit standard against which current behavior is evaluated. If you've been running 5 days a week for 6 months, missing a day feels wrong. The self-concept flags the absence as a departure from normal. But if you've been running 2 days a week for the past month, 2 days is normal. The self-concept has been quietly updated. The alarm that should have fired when the standard dropped never fired, because the standard dropped too slowly for the alarm to register the change. You don't notice the drift, because you're always comparing against recent behavior. And recent behavior is the drift. There's a specific emotional signature to the period just before drift becomes visible. It feels like flexibility, like you've matured past the rigid early stages of discipline when you needed strict rules because the behavior wasn't yet stable, and arrived at a more sophisticated relationship with your own consistency. You're not a machine. You're someone who listens to what they need. You're someone who can take a rest day without it meaning anything. The framing is generous and partially true, which is what makes it dangerous. It is also, in a significant number of cases, the story that drift tells about itself to avoid being identified. Real flexibility is choosing to modify a standard from a position of stability. When the foundation is secure, when the identity is solid, when the deviation is genuinely chosen rather than gradually defaulted into. Drift masquerading as flexibility is modification from a position of erosion, where the standard is already lower than intended, and the story of flexibility is providing cover for the fact that the return hasn't happened yet. The question that distinguishes them is simple and uncomfortable. Is this a deliberate choice, or is this what's been happening? Am I choosing a lighter week, or have I been having lighter weeks without choosing them? I've been on the wrong side of this distinction more than once. The version I remember most clearly involved a writing practice I'd built to a genuine consistency over several months, daily without exception, producing something whether or not it felt productive. Then a period of travel interrupted it. The interruption was legitimate. The return, when it came, was partial. Not daily, not without exception, but regular enough to feel like maintenance. I told myself I was being flexible. What I was actually doing was operating from a degraded standard and calling it maturity. The daily practice was gone. The story that I still had a writing practice was intact. The story was wrong. The catch is that drift doesn't require a dramatic cause. Travel interrupted mine. But drift can start from almost nothing. A slightly later morning that makes the habit slightly harder to fit. A week of lower energy that makes the abbreviated version feel necessary. A period of high output in one area that quietly deprioritizes another. None of these are failures. All of them are entry points for drift if the return to the original standard doesn't happen explicitly and soon. The mechanism that drift exploits is the brain's preference for gradual change over abrupt change. Abrupt departures from identity trigger the self-concept alarm. Gradual departures slip past it, updating the model incrementally until the new lower standard has been fully incorporated and the alarm no longer has a prior standard to compare against. By the time drift is visible, the self-concept has already been partially rewritten. You're not returning to a standard you held until recently. You're trying to return to a standard that now feels slightly aspirational. Catching drift requires a different kind of awareness than catching failure. Failure announces itself. Drift requires you to periodically compare your current behavior not against recent behavior, but against your intended standard. The one you set when your thinking was clear, before the accommodations started accumulating. This comparison is uncomfortable because it often reveals a gap you didn't know was there. The gap is not a verdict. It is navigation. It tells you that the return is necessary and shows you approximately how far back the starting point is. The return from drift is not a restart. It is a recalibration. You are not beginning again from zero. The foundation is still there. The neural architecture is still there. The identity still contains the update even if recent behavior has been inconsistent with it. You are tightening back to a standard that drifted, not rebuilding a standard that was destroyed. The distinction matters because it changes how long the return takes and how hard it needs to be. Recalibration is not dramatic. It doesn't require a new commitment or a redesigned system or a fresh start with ceremony. It requires noticing the drift and returning to the standard on the next available instance. Not next week. Not after the current period of difficulty resolves. On the next available instance. Because drift, like most forms of erosion, stops the moment you stop moving in the direction of it. The exception was reasonable. The next exception was understandable. The pattern that the exceptions formed was neither. See the pattern. Name it accurately. Return to the standard without requiring yourself to feel ready. The standard is what you decided when you were thinking clearly. On most days, you are not thinking more clearly than that. Trust the standard over the current negotiation. The negotiation is drift talking. The standard is you. Chapter 15. The person on the other side. The version of you that you're building doesn't feel like a better you. It feels like the actual you. The one that was always there, just never given enough uninterrupted time to surface. This is the part that surprises people. They expect the destination to feel like an achievement, like arriving somewhere, like looking back at the distance traveled and feeling the appropriate sense of accomplishment. Sometimes that happens, but more often, the experience of having built genuine consistency is quieter and stranger than that. It feels less like becoming someone new and more like stopping being someone you never quite believed you were. The performed version falls away. What's left doesn't feel like a better self. It feels like the self without the interference. The interference was the gap between your private standard and your public behavior. The interference was the chronic, low-level noise of broken promises accumulating into background self-doubt. The interference was the energy spent negotiating with yourself about whether to do what you already knew you were going to do. The internal argument that consumed resources before the behavior even started. When the consistency becomes structural, when the identity has updated and the behaviors have crossed into the automatic layer, the interference goes quiet. And in the quiet, something becomes available that wasn't before. Not inspiration, not confidence in the motivational poster sense, just capacity. Clean capacity, unencumbered by the drag of the previous version's unresolved business. Picture someone who, 3 years ago, could not reliably complete a week of their own intended behavior without negotiating themselves out of at least half of it. The person existed then. The capacity existed then. The intelligence, the desire, the genuine intention, all present, all real. What was also present was the interference, the identity that didn't quite believe, The self-trust deficit accumulated from years of broken small promises, the habit architecture that kept pulling toward familiar patterns regardless of intention. All of that was running simultaneously, underneath the surface, making every deliberate action cost more than it should. 3 years later, the same person moves differently. Not faster necessarily. Not with more visible effort. With less friction. The things that used to require significant activation energy now require almost none. The decisions that used to involve lengthy internal negotiation are no longer decisions. The capacity that used to be partially consumed by the overhead of self-management is now available for the actual work. That's not a different person. That's the same person with the interference removed. What the interference was costing is only fully visible in retrospect. While you're inside it, the overhead feels normal. It's always been there. It's the ambient condition of trying to maintain discipline. It's just what this costs. From the outside of it, looking back, the cost is staggering. How much energy went into the negotiation rather than the behavior? How much bandwidth was occupied by the background noise of accumulated, unfinished commitments? How much of what felt like a capacity limitation was actually a friction tax on capacity that was always sufficient? The person on the other side is not superhuman. They have not transcended the normal conditions of human psychology. They still experience fatigue, resistance, competing desires, difficult days, periods when nothing feels easy. The difference is structural. They are experiencing those conditions from a foundation that doesn't wobble under them. The hard day is hard. It is not also an identity crisis. The resistance is present. It is not also a referendum on whether they are someone who can follow through. Those questions were answered by the accumulated evidence of enough ordinary days. They don't reopen. This is what self-trust at a structural level actually feels like from the inside. Not confidence. Confidence is contingent. It rises and falls with results and circumstances and the quality of recent performance. Self-trust at a structural level is quieter and more durable than confidence. It is the settled knowledge, based on sufficient evidence, that you will do what you say you will do. Not always perfectly, not under all conditions without exception, but reliably enough that your own word carries weight with you. That when you make a commitment, a part of you takes it seriously in a way that a part of you years earlier could not. That weight changes everything downstream. Decisions made from self-trust have a different quality than decisions made from self-doubt. They are more accurate because they're not distorted by the defensive optimism that makes self-doubt bearable, the inflation of intentions that compensates for the expectation of under-delivery. They are more stable because they don't require constant remotivation to hold, don't collapse under the first pressure that makes following through inconvenient. They are more honest because you are no longer negotiating with yourself about who you are, just deciding what you want to do. I want to be precise about something, because imprecision here creates a false destination. The person on the other side is not someone for whom everything is easy. They are someone for whom the right things are easier than they used to be, and some of the wrong things are harder. The path of least resistance has shifted, skipping the practice, breaking the commitment, defaulting to the old pattern. These now carry a cost they didn't use to carry, because the identity on the other side is one that registers departures from standard as departures. The alarm works. The floor is higher. The return, when necessary, is faster. This is not a loss of freedom. It is a different kind of freedom. The freedom that comes from having a self you can rely on, rather than a self you are perpetually managing. The building of this person was never a single project with a clear completion date. It was, and continues to be, a direction. A consistent orientation toward behavior that matches intention, promises that get kept, standards that get maintained even when maintenance is inconvenient. The direction compounds. Each day in the direction adds to the structure. Each return from drift reinforces the foundation. Each time the quit signal fires and gets ignored, the threshold moves. There is no final arrival. There is increasing alignment between who you intend to be and who you are when no one is watching, including yourself. The gap closes incrementally over time, through the mechanism of showing up on ordinary days for long enough that ordinary days no longer require showing up to be convinced. You already know everything this book contains. Not intellectually. You knew most of it intellectually before you started. You know it now in the way that changes behavior, through the architecture of understanding why the mechanisms work, what they're doing underneath the surface, why the ordinary day is not a compromise, but a construction. The person on the other side of enough ordinary days is not waiting for you to become worthy of them. They are waiting for you to stop stopping. The ordinary days are still there. So is the person. You don't need to be more motivated. You need to be harder to talk out of things. That's the shift. Not louder intention, not stronger willpower, not a better system designed in a more inspired moment. Just a version of you that the internal negotiation can no longer reach. One that has accumulated enough evidence of its own reliability that the voice suggesting reasons to stop carries less weight than it used to. Not silenced, less convincing. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. Everything in this book was pointing at that version of you, the morning you stop surrendering before the day begins, the attention you stop bleeding into engineered distraction, the discomfort you walk into instead of around, the small promises that quietly rebuild the foundation of your own word, the unfinished things you close so your mind stops carrying them, the lapses you return from without ceremony, the quit signal you learn to recognize as a location marker rather than an instruction, the old patterns you redirect instead of fight, the private hours where the real character is built, the ordinary days you show up for when nothing about them demands it, the identity ceiling you raise by feeding the right story with the right evidence, the comparison you stop using as a verdict, the consistency that eventually crosses the line from something you maintain to something you simply are, the drift you catch before it becomes a destination, the person on the other side who was never a fantasy, just a direction, pursued without stopping. None of it was complicated. All of it was necessary. The last thing worth saying is this: the work does not end, but it changes. The early phase is effortful. Everything requires conscious decision, deliberate maintenance, active resistance to the pull of old patterns. That phase is real, and it is hard, and it is also temporary. Past a certain accumulation of ordinary days, the nature of the work shifts. It stops being about making yourself do things and starts being about deciding what to do with someone who does them. The effort migrates from maintenance to direction, from keeping the foundation intact to deciding what to build on top of it. That migration is the reward nobody advertises because it's too quiet to make a good story. It doesn't feel like a triumph. It feels like Tuesday. Tuesday when you did the thing. Again. Without negotiating. Without requiring a reason beyond the fact that it's who you are now. Go be that person. One ordinary day at a time, for as many ordinary days as it takes. It takes fewer than you think.